Ashley had fallen in love with Brian because of his music. It wasn't just his talent, though his fingers danced effortlessly over the strings of his guitar, weaving melodies that made the world around them disappear. It was his passion. The way his eyes lit up when he performed, the way his voice carried through the dimly lit bars and made even strangers stop and listen. She was part of his dream. He would write songs about her, about them, about the quiet moments they shared. She had been so proud of him, so convinced that one day he would make it big. They talked about it endlessly, moving to a bigger city, getting a record deal, making music their life. But life had other plans. The pregnancy wasn't expected, but it wasn't unwelcome either. When Ashley told Brian, she saw the fear in his eyes, but also something softer. He held her tightly that night, whispering promises into her hair about how they would figure it out, how nothing would change between them, how he would love both her and their child with everything he had. At first, it seemed like he meant it. He still played, still practiced, still hummed melodies into her growing belly. But as the due date approached, the weight of reality settled onto his shoulders. Late-night gigs turned into early morning shifts at the factory. The band stopped meeting as often. There was always an excuse. He was too tired, they weren't getting anywhere, they needed stability. Ashley tried to understand. She did. She knew they had bills to pay, a future to think about. But watching him trade in his guitar for steel-toed boots and 12-hour shifts broke something inside of her. The man she fell in love with, the dreamer, the artist, the musician, was disappearing, replaced by someone else. Someone who came home exhausted, barely spoke, and collapsed onto the couch before dinner was even finished. Their conversations became transactional. Did you pay the gas bill? Yeah. Did you call the daycare? I'll do it tomorrow. Brian, you said that yesterday. I said I'll do it. There was no laughter anymore. No music. The house felt colder, emptier, even with the baby's cries filling the silence. She missed him. She missed who they were before. She tried to bring it up once, carefully, after putting the baby to sleep. You never play anymore, she said softly, watching him stare blankly at the television. He barely looked at her. Too tired. The words stung. Not because they weren't true, but because they sounded like an excuse. You don't even listen to it anymore, she whispered. He sighed, rubbing his temples like she was just another problem waiting to be solved. Can we not do this right now? That was how it always went. Whenever she tried to reach him, to pull him back to the man she had once known, he shut her down. He acted like she was nagging, like she was selfish for wanting him to still have a piece of himself that wasn't just work and exhaustion. And maybe she was. Maybe she was selfish for resenting the fact that everything had changed, for hating the way he barely looked at her anymore. Because that was the worst part, wasn't it? It wasn't just that he didn't play music anymore. It was that he didn't see her anymore. She wasn't Ashley, the girl who danced in the front row of his shows, who whispered encouragement in his ear before he went on stage. She was Ashley, the mother of his child. The woman who reminded him to take out the trash. The person he barely spoke to over dinner. One night, after another long shift at the factory, Brian came home to find Ashley sitting on the couch, an old record spinning on the turntable. It was one of his favorites, one they used to play when they first moved in together, back when their apartment had been filled with nothing but second-hand furniture and dreams. She watched him from across the room, hoping, praying, that he would remember. But he didn't. He sighed, rubbed his face, and walked past her without a word. She sat there, staring at the empty doorway, as the record kept playing. And that was when she knew. It wasn't the music that was gone. It was them. Brian came home later than usual that evening, his body aching from another grueling shift at the factory. The weight of exhaustion settled into his muscles, a familiar companion he had long since stopped questioning. His hands, once skilled at strumming melodies on his guitar, were now calloused from hours of gripping metal tools, his fingers stained with the grime of long days and longer nights. He set his lunchbox on the counter, the sound barely audible over the quiet hum of voices drifting in from the living room. At first, he thought it was the television, some late-night talk show playing in the background. But as he took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the TV. It was Ashley's voice. And she wasn't alone. He moved carefully, stopping just outside the doorway. His body tensed instinctively, though he didn't know why. He wasn't spying. This was his home. His wife. But something in the way she spoke, the lightness in her voice that had long since disappeared when she spoke to him, made his stomach clench. He stayed still, letting the words reach him before he even realized what he was doing. "He's just not the same anymore," Ashley sighed, her voice carrying the kind of sadness that felt too familiar, the kind that cut deeper than anger ever could. "I don't even know who I married some days. I look at him and he's just there. Existing. It's like all he does is work, eat, sleep, repeat. I try to talk to him, but it's like talking to a wall." Brian's fingers curled into his palms, the sting of his nails pressing into his skin, grounding him in the moment. "Of course he's different," Claire, Ashley's friend, replied, her tone laced with exasperation. "Ashley, come on. You married a musician. A guy with dreams, with fire in his eyes. Now he's just some factory worker. No offense, but did you really think he'd still be exciting after all this? Men like that don't stay the same once real life hits. He's boring now. And honestly, you deserve more." Brian exhaled slowly, a quiet, deliberate motion, as if controlling his breathing would somehow control the sharp, cutting pain spreading through his chest. Ashley didn't respond right away, and for one fleeting, desperate second, Brian hoped, prayed, that she would disagree, that she would defend him, say something to push back against Claire's words. He needed to hear her say that their life wasn't perfect but that it was still worth something, that he was still worth something. Instead, she spoke in a voice so small he almost didn't recognize it. "I don't know what I want anymore." The words hung in the air, a cruel echo of every silent fear Brian had buried deep inside him. Claire sighed dramatically. "I do. I know exactly what you need." There was a shuffle, the sound of a glass being set down on the table. "You need excitement. You need someone who makes you feel alive again. Someone successful, someone who can give you the life you should have had. You remember Nicholas, right?" Ashley hesitated. "The businessman?" "Yes. He's been asking about you." Claire's voice was smooth, persuasive. "I told him how beautiful you are, how you've been stuck in this routine with Brian, and you know what he said? He said he wants to meet you. Just meet. Nothing serious. Just a drink." Brian's jaw tightened, his breath slow and deliberate, but his pulse was pounding in his ears. "Claire, I don't know." Ashley's voice wavered, uncertain, but there was something else beneath it. Something that made Brian's stomach turn. "You don't have to do anything," Claire pressed. "Just go have fun. Talk to a man who actually has ambition. Someone who doesn't come home covered in sweat and oil every night. No pressure." There was a long pause, and Brian felt himself holding on to something invisible, something fragile and slipping through his fingers. Then, in the softest voice, Ashley whispered, "Eh?" The ground beneath him didn't crack. The walls didn't collapse. The house didn't shake. But something inside Brian broke, something deep and unspoken, something he hadn't even realized he had been clinging to. She had said yes. She had agreed, without hesitation, without protest, without even a second thought about the man who had given up his dreams for her, for their child, for the life they built together. Brian stood there, frozen in place, as the conversation continued, Claire laughing, but he wasn't listening anymore. He should have walked in, should have let them see him standing there, should have demanded answers, but instead he turned away. He moved through the hallway in a haze, his steps slow, deliberate, as if the weight of what he had just heard had made him forget how to move altogether. The bathroom mirror greeted him with a reflection he barely recognized. He wasn't the man who had once stayed up all night writing songs, who had played his heart out in smoky bars with nothing but hope keeping him going. He was someone else now. Someone smaller, diminished, a man whose wife had just agreed, so easily, so carelessly, to entertain the idea of another man. His stomach churned as the humiliation set in, spreading through his veins like poison. She thought he was boring. She thought another man, someone rich, someone powerful, someone with clean hands and an easy life, would be better suited for her. She thought he was nothing. Brian swallowed hard, his throat tight, his hands gripping the edges of the sink as if he needed to hold onto something, anything, to keep from falling apart. He stood there, breathing through the pain, through the sharp edge of betrayal cutting through his ribs. Maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't the same man anymore. But if she thought he would just sit back, if she thought he would let her slip away into the arms of another man without a fight, if she thought he was weak, she was wrong. Brian had never thought of himself as the kind of man who would check his wife's phone. He had spent years believing that trust was the foundation of their marriage, that even when things were difficult, when silence stretched between them like a chasm, there was still something unspoken holding them together. He had convinced himself that no matter how much they drifted, no matter how far apart they felt, Ashley was still his wife, and that had to mean something. But ever since that night, ever since he had stood in the hallway, listening to her agree to meet another man, he had felt something inside him slowly unravel. He had tried, in the days that followed, to pretend it had been nothing, to act as though the words he had heard in the kitchen were just meaningless chatter, something easily dismissed. He told himself that she wouldn't actually go through with it, that it was just a drink, just an escape, just a moment of fantasy that would never become real. But then she started coming home late. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was small things, a trip to the store that took longer than expected, a late meeting at work that she hadn't mentioned before, an errand that somehow stretched into hours. He noticed the shift, the way she would walk through the door with a different kind of energy. She had stopped waiting up for him, stopped asking about his day, stopped even pretending to be interested in the routine of their life together. And when he finally asked her about it, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, to act as though he wasn't already drowning in suspicion, she had barely even looked at him. "You're home late again," Ashley had sighed, dropping her purse onto the counter, her fingers rubbing at her temple as if the mere act of being questioned was too much effort. "Yeah, work ran over. That was it." No details, no apology, no effort to explain. Just a statement, cold and simple, before she moved on like the conversation had already ended. The next night, it happened again. And this time, when she came home even later, Brian pushed harder, trying to find something, anything, that would make sense of the gnawing feeling in his gut. "What's going on, Ash?" His voice had been quieter this time, edged with something dangerous, something he wasn't sure he could hold back much longer. "I told you. Work's been crazy." She had answered too quickly, her shoulders tensing for just a fraction of a second before she turned away. "Since when?" The silence that followed had been deafening. She had stiffened for only a moment, so quickly that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But Brian did. He noticed everything now. The way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands tightened around the strap of her purse, the way she suddenly seemed more impatient with him than she ever had before. "I don't know, Brian." Her voice had turned sharp, defensive. "Do you want me to quit my job? Is that what this is about?" He had stared at her, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "That's not what I said." "Then stop interrogating me," she had muttered, brushing past him as she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving him standing in the kitchen alone. The humiliation settled into his stomach like a stone. She had turned it around on him so easily, making it seem as though he was the problem, as though he was being unreasonable, as though his concern was nothing more than paranoia. And maybe that was the worst part. She was so good at it, so quick to dismiss him, so effortless in the way she twisted the truth just enough to make him question himself. But Brian knew better. He remembered the conversation in the kitchen. He remembered the way Claire had encouraged her, the way she had dangled the idea of Nicholas in front of Ashley like some grand solution to her boredom. He remembered the way Ashley had hesitated, the way her voice had carried that quiet, hesitant excitement when she had agreed to meet him. And now she was lying. That meant it had gone further than that. That night, long after Ashley had fallen asleep, Brian sat alone in the darkened living room, his mind replaying every moment, every sign, every time he had ignored his own instincts. The weight of it all pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, until he finally stood, moving through the house as if pulled by something inevitable. The bedroom was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of the nightstand lamp. But that time was gone, lost somewhere between the life they used to dream about and the reality they had settled into. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for her phone. He wasn't this man. He wasn't the kind of husband who invaded his wife's privacy. But she wasn't the kind of wife who lied. And yet, here they were. The screen lit up in his hands, and for a brief moment he told himself he wouldn't find anything. That he would scroll through her messages and see nothing out of the ordinary, that he would be proven wrong, that he could still believe, desperately, foolishly, that this wasn't what he thought it was. But the name was there. Bold. Unapologetic. Nicholas. His thumb hesitated before tapping the message thread, and then, just like that, he saw it all. Brian's grip on the phone tightened, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales, as if trying to contain the slow, burning rage creeping through his veins. His hands trembled as he scrolled, his eyes scanning every word, every excuse, every small betrayal hidden in messages that had seemed so harmless at first but now read like a carefully woven web of deception. His stomach twisted violently, but he forced himself to keep scrolling, his vision blurring with something he refused to name. And then, just like that, it was over. He set the phone down carefully, deliberately, as if it were something fragile, something poisonous. His eyes moved to Ashley's sleeping form, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. She had done it. She had lied to his face. And she had done it so easily. Brian exhaled, slow and shaky, his fists clenching at his sides as he forced himself to breathe through the storm raging inside him. She thought he wouldn't find out. She thought he wouldn't fight back. She thought he would just sit there, helpless, watching as she walked away into the arms of another man. But she was wrong. Very, very wrong. Brian didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of Ashley's breathing beside him, feeling the unbearable weight of betrayal pressing down on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the messages again, the way she had responded to Nicholas with hesitant excitement, the way she had let herself be flattered, courted, tempted. He had scrolled through them so many times they were burned into his memory, each word cutting deeper, each sentence a fresh wound. He had expected guilt, regret, something that would make him believe she had been caught up in something she didn't really want. But there was none of that. She had wanted it. She had chosen this. When the sun finally began to creep through the blinds, casting weak light across the bedroom, Brian felt like a man on the edge of something irreversible. He had spent years sacrificing for her, for their family, giving up his music, working himself to exhaustion so they could have a life together. And now, after everything, she was making him the fool. She had walked into their home, their bed, every night with this secret sitting inside her like a loaded gun, knowing that if he ever found out, it would destroy him. And she hadn't even hesitated. He turned his head, looking at her. She was still asleep. The sight of her made his stomach churn. He had to know. He had to hear her say it. His whole body felt tense, his muscles coiled like he was preparing for a fight he hadn't even decided how to start. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, then turned to her. Ashley. His voice was rough, low, barely controlled. She stirred, groaning slightly, stretching before blinking up at him in sleepy confusion. What? He held up her phone. Her eyes flickered toward it, and in that split second, before she could school her expression, Brian saw it. The recognition, the understanding, and worst of all, the lack of surprise. She knew. She had known this was coming. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair out of her face, exhaling like this was nothing more than an inconvenience. You went through my phone? That's what you care about? His voice was eerily calm, but his fingers were gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Not what I found? Ashley sighed heavily. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look scared. She looked tired, annoyed even, as if he were the problem, as if he was making a scene over something insignificant. I don't know what you want me to say, Brian. She spoke carefully, almost bored. You don't know what to say? A bitter laugh escaped him. You could start with why. Why lie? Why? He gestured around the room, his voice rising slightly. Why throw all of this away? She shook her head, rubbing her temples like he was giving her a headache. I didn't throw anything away, Brian. She exhaled sharply. I needed something. Something you stopped giving me a long time ago. His stomach twisted, a sickening knot of anger and disbelief forming inside him. And what's that? Attention. The word fell from her lips effortlessly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to look somewhere else? I didn't, Brian. But I was lonely. I was exhausted. I was tired of feeling like I was living with a ghost. Brian's breath came short and uneven. I was working. I was keeping this family together. You were gone, she snapped, turning to face him fully now, her eyes flashing with something dark and unyielding. You were never here, Brian. Even when you weren't really here. You think punching in shifts at the factory makes you a husband? A father? You think just existing in this house is enough? His pulse pounded in his ears. I did all of this for you. For me. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. No, Brian. You did it because it was easier than admitting that you let go of who you used to be. That you lost yourself. And you think that's my fault? You think it's my job to sit here and wait while you waste away? Brian stared at her, his hands trembling at his sides. He had imagined this conversation going 100 different ways, but never this. Never her standing her ground like she had done nothing wrong. Never her twisting everything, making him the villain, making it seem like she had no choice but to betray him. You didn't even deny it, he murmured, his voice hollow. You didn't even try. Ashley shook her head, exhaling like she had already won. Because what's the point? You already know. And deep down you already know why. His stomach twisted. He had expected guilt. He had expected tears. He had expected some kind of desperate attempt at an excuse. But Ashley wasn't sorry. She had convinced herself that this was his fault. That she was the victim. He felt sick. Brian stood up abruptly, the movement jerky, fueled by the surge of rage clawing at his insides. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room, out of this house, away from the woman who had once been his entire world and was now looking at him like he was nothing more than an obstacle in her way. Ashley didn't move. She sat there, staring at him, as if waiting for him to crumble, to break under the weight of everything she had just thrown at him. And maybe once he would have. Maybe months ago he would have begged. Maybe he would have blamed himself. Maybe he would have asked her how he could fix it, how he could make her love him again, how he could become the man she wanted. But not now. Now he saw her for what she was. She wasn't sorry. She never would be. He turned and walked out, his footsteps heavy against the floor. Ashley didn't call after him. She didn't stop him. And that, more than anything, told him exactly how much she had already let him go. He sat in the living room, his hands gripping the arms of the chair like he needed to hold onto something solid to keep from falling apart. The walls of their house, the house they had built together, the house where their child took his first steps, where they had once whispered about dreams and futures, felt suffocating now, pressing in on him, drowning him in memories that no longer belonged to him. Ashley was still in the bedroom, probably sleeping soundly, unbothered, because why wouldn't she be? She had made her choice long before he ever found out. His hands ached from clenching them too hard, his mind spiraling between anger and disbelief. He wanted to scream at her, to make her understand the weight of what she had done. But what was the point? She didn't care. She had made that clear. She had looked him in the eye and told him that this destruction of their life was his fault. That she had done nothing wrong. That she was entitled to it. He had spent years working himself to exhaustion for their family. He had given up everything he wanted, to make sure Ashley and their child had a stable life. And in return, she had laughed about him behind his back, entertained another man like Brian was just a placeholder she had outgrown, and when confronted, she hadn't even tried to deny it. Instead, she had blamed him. There was nothing left to fight for. The thought settled deep inside him, heavy and undeniable. Their marriage wasn't dying. It was dead. He could see it now, clear as day. By morning, he had made his decision. Ashley emerged from the bedroom as if nothing had happened. She moved through the kitchen with ease, pouring herself a cup of coffee, glancing at him once before sitting at the table, her expression unreadable. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look sad. She looked ready, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Brian swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, forcing his voice to stay even. I'm filing for divorce. Ashley exhaled through her nose, nodding slightly, and took a sip of her coffee. I figured, The ease with which she accepted it made something inside him twist painfully. "That's all you have to say?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, but he didn't care. "You destroy everything we had, and you figure?" Ashley set her mug down carefully, her fingers tapping against the ceramic. "What do you want me to say, Brian? That I'm shocked? That I'm heartbroken?" She let out a small, humorless laugh. "We've both known this was coming. You just didn't want to admit it." His jaw clenched. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low and tight. "I didn't know you were lying to my face every night while sneaking around with Nicholas." She didn't flinch. "It was never about him." "Don't," he snapped, slamming his palm against the table, making her coffee cup rattle. "Don't sit there and act like you're the victim. I never said I was." She leaned back in her chair, watching him. "But you need to understand something, Brian. This didn't happen overnight. This wasn't some sudden decision. It wasn't about Nicholas or Claire or anyone else. It was about us. Or, more accurately, what we weren't anymore." Brian let out a breath, shaking his head. "You should have told me you were unhappy." Ashley tilted her head slightly, considering him. Would it have changed anything? The question knocked the wind out of him. Because the truth was he didn't know. Would it have changed anything? Would he have suddenly become the man she wanted again? Or had she made up her mind long before she let herself fall into someone else's arms? "You didn't even try," he muttered. Ashley let out a quiet sigh, almost like she was disappointed in him. "I did, Brian. I tried for a long time. But you never noticed. You were too busy working, too busy being exhausted, too busy surviving." She shook her head. "And I got tired of waiting for you to come back to me." Brian stared at her, feeling that same unbearable weight settle in his chest. This was the moment where he was supposed to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that she hadn't tried hard enough, that she should have fought for them instead of giving up. But what was the point? It didn't matter anymore. He could see it in her face, she was already gone. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I'll handle the paperwork." Ashley nodded. "All right." That was it. Ashley got up from the table, rinsed out her mug, and walked away without another word. And Brian just sat there, staring at the spot she had left empty. The days that followed were a blur of legal documents and quiet conversations. They told their families, their friends, and Ashley moved into the spare bedroom without any ceremony, as if she had been waiting for the moment she could finally separate herself from him. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't fight him on anything. When the papers were officially filed, she signed them without hesitation. Brian expected it to feel like a relief. He had spent weeks suffocating in the wreckage of their marriage, drowning in the realization that Ashley had never once considered turning back. He had expected to feel lighter once the weight of it was finally lifted. But instead, all he felt was a dull emptiness. The night before she officially moved out, he found himself standing in the doorway of the bedroom that had once been theirs, watching as she folded the last of her clothes into a suitcase. She glanced up at him, but there was no tension, no lingering emotion. Just quiet acceptance. "You really don't regret it, do you?" His voice was quieter than he intended, lacking the anger that had burned in him for so long. Ashley exhaled softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I regret that it ended this way," she admitted. "But I don't regret leaving a marriage that wasn't working anymore." Brian let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "Yeah." She stood, dragging her suitcase toward the door. As she passed him, she paused for just a moment, as if debating saying something else. But whatever thought had crossed her mind, she let it go. "Goodbye, Brian." And just like that, she was gone. The house felt unbearably quiet after that. Brian sat alone in the dark that night, staring at the empty space where her things had once been, and wondered how a love that had once felt so unshakable had crumbled into nothing at all. The first few months after the divorce were the hardest. Brian had always imagined that if his marriage ever ended, it would be in some explosive moment, yelling, tears, doors slamming, someone storming out with no intention of looking back. But there had been none of that. Just papers signed with quiet indifference, a few awkward logistics about their child, and then silence. Ashley had packed her things and walked out of their home, and just like that, she was gone. At first, Brian thought he would feel relief. But instead, all he felt was an unbearable emptiness. The house, once filled with arguments and tension, felt even worse without her in it. At least before, there had been something, resentment, anger, a lingering sense of something unresolved. Now there was just quiet. He threw himself into work, picking up extra shifts at the factory, coming home too exhausted to think. He joined a gym, spending hours pushing himself until his body ached, until there was no room left for anything but the physical pain. But no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sweat, Ashley's words still lingered in his mind. "You were never here, Brian." He hated that they still had power over him. And the worst part was, some small, ugly part of him still wondered if she had been right. Had he really been that absent? Had he driven her away without realizing it? Had he let their marriage crumble while he convinced himself he was doing the right thing? A year passed. The pain dulled, but it never fully disappeared. He learned how to live with it, how to function despite it, how to be alone without feeling like it was a punishment. He kept going to the gym, built muscle where exhaustion had once lived, and slowly, piece by piece, he started to rebuild himself. And then, one evening, he came home to find a note on his doorstep. The moment he saw the handwriting, his breath caught. Ashley. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope like it was something poisonous, something that could pull him under again if he let it. His fingers hesitated before finally opening it. "Brian, please meet me. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. The cafe on Main Street. No apology. No explanation. Just a request, simple and direct." Brian should have thrown it away. Should have crumpled it in his fist and let it drop to the floor, ignored it like she had ignored him for so long. But before he could think too much, before he could remind himself of all the reasons he should hate her, he found himself setting the note down on the counter instead of the trash. And the next evening at 5:55 p.m., he was at the cafe. Ashley was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She looked different. Not in any drastic way, but in a way that made something deep in Brian's chest twist. Her hair wasn't as carefully styled as it used to be. There were faint shadows under her eyes. She had always been effortlessly put together, always polished in a way that made it seem like life never touched her. But now she just looked tired. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time in a long time, he saw something unfamiliar in her expression. "Brian," she breathed, her voice softer than he remembered. He pulled out the chair across from her but didn't sit. "Say whatever it is you need to say." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like she needed to steady herself. "I was wrong," she said finally. Brian said nothing. Ashley exhaled shakily, dropping her gaze. "Nicholas, I don't know what I thought. That he actually cared about me. But I was stupid." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. It wasn't long before he moved on. Found someone younger. Someone new. And I was left with nothing. Brian clenched his jaw. A year ago, those words would have destroyed him. But standing there now, all he felt was exhaustion. "I lost everything," Ashley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nicholas, Claire, the people I thought were my friends. They disappeared the moment I wasn't worth anything to them anymore. And I realized too late what I had done." She finally met his eyes, and for the first time in so long, she looked like the Ashley he used to know. Not the cold, distant woman who had told him their marriage was over. Just Ashley. The woman he had once loved. The woman he had given everything to. "I miss you, Brian." Her voice broke slightly. "I miss us." He closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. "Ashley, I know I don't deserve to ask this," she cut in quickly, desperation creeping into her tone now. "I know I don't, but I want to come back. I want to fix this. I want us to be a family again." Brian exhaled slowly, opening his eyes to look at her. She was searching his face, waiting, hoping. And for the first time since she had walked out of his life, he realized he felt nothing. No anger. No bitterness. No longing for what they used to be. She had spent so much time making him believe that their marriage had fallen apart because of him, that he was the reason she had strayed, that he was the one who hadn't been enough. And he had believed it. For so long he had let those words haunt him, let them dig into his skin, let them make him question every choice he had ever made. But now, standing in front of her, hearing her ask for another chance, he saw the truth. It had never been about him. Ashley had made her choice. She had walked away, convinced the grass was greener on the other side. And when she realized it wasn't, she had come crawling back, not because she loved him, not because she regretted losing him, but because she didn't want to be alone. Brian pushed the chair back and stood. Ashley's expression flickered with panic. "Brian? I hope you figure things out, Ashley." His voice was calm, steady. "But you don't get to come back." Her mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to argue, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. He turned and walked away without looking back. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, a strange sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, he was free.